Hi, this is Steve Hunt. In this episode of Integrate or Die, we talk with Christopher Lind, who's a business transformation advisor and a former chief learning officer. Why I asked Christopher to be on the show is because of his extensive background using technology to improve learning and employee development. And he shares a variety of really fascinating comments. One, he talks a lot about AI. He really is a student, not just of learning, but a student of technology. Actually, like myself, he started out as a computer programmer before getting into this field. And he talks a lot about how some of these advanced technologies are affecting learning. He also talks a lot on the importance of focusing what we need to improve and less on what we need to know. He says there's a tendency when using technology or developing learning programs to focus on what we're good at, which supports but is not what really matters at the end of the day. What matters is not what we know how to do, but how what we know how to do is able to impact the things that the business cares about. He also similarly says how important it is to understand the environment before taking action, and sort of comments that support functions like learning, recruiting, and all these other tech functions, I mean, HR functions and technology functions, how these support functions operate is going to change based on who they're supporting and the nature of the environment, the people working that they're supporting. And last, he comments that if you're really good at doing learning and using learning technology, it's not a hard sell. Because at the end of the day, what this technology, if it's being used appropriately, is it makes people more successful in doing their job. And everyone's motivated to be more successful in doing their job. The key is that you just have to use the technology so it's very clear to people how use of that technology is going to help them be more successful in achieving their goals. So this and a lot of other interesting things in this episode, let's give a listen to Christopher Lind. Thank you. Hi, my name is Steve Hunt. Welcome to this episode of Integrate or Die, where we're talking with Christopher Lind. Christopher, we always start this with me telling you why I thought you'd be great to be on the show. And the reason why is when we met, you are a learning background. You're an ed psychologist like me. We're both psychologists, slightly different field, but you've come at it from a learning perspective as a psychologist. You actually were a computer programmer. Your career in HR has been mainly as like a chief learning officer in that area where you've leveraged technology, and you kind of have this perspective. And we were laughing that there's actually a lot of parallels between.
Yeah,
I haven't met very many psychologists that were computer programmers that have gone into the HR world, but you're one
yeah,
of them.
yeah.
So that's how I describe you. But how would you describe your area of expertise, the perspective you bring to this world of HR technology, and how you got here?
So in terms of how I actually think the tagline I have on LinkedIn describes it pretty well, which is bridging business technology and human experience.
Hmm.
And so I've actually always really found myself, even though if you looked at my LinkedIn, you'd be like, oh, he's been a learning guy. I've always been like, no, learning's a side effect of what I do. It's not who I am. It's just a side effect of that. Because at the end of the day, businesses run on people.
Hmm.
And so the complexities of people, that's actually why I left the computer engineering field
Hmm.
was I went, I like, I mean, I can build software and I'm interested in tech, but I'm actually more interested in how tech is influencing human behavior and
Hmm.
the way the world works and the way businesses run. And I've got kind of a unique background in that, and it's a major passion point for me. So that I think is I think you're spot on in that, and that's always what's made me feel. I guess in some ways you probably have experienced this. I feel like I never fit in, and I think over time have just discovered that's actually a superpower, not a disability.
Yeah, I definitely can have that relationship, sort of that sense of you don't, or more so, I don't want to like go in one area. I mean, for me, it's always been if I talk too much about the technology, I want to talk about the psychology. But if I talk too much psychology, I want to talk about the business. I mean, I get
Yep.
to me the most fascinating conversations are when these three things come together. Because my
Yes.
tagline is,
Yeah, well, because in
very
companies, a
similar.
lot of times they're treated like they're three independent things. And it's like, they're not. They are one and of the same, and you have to think about them that way. Thinking about them not like that actually is why we have such dismal failure or such significant failure rates.
Yeah, absolutely. Or really crappy processes. And I'm curious
Right.
to what extent diving because you I think when I look compare you to other guests we've had on the show, you have spent a lot of time though in sort of the trenches of HR,
Yes,
where you're a consumer of this technology as opposed to a builder or an implementer of it.
correct.
Um, and I am curious as you're looking at this, one question would be I often say that our understanding of technology enables or constrains our imagination of what work can be. And then in a lot of organizations, we have really lousy processes because they're kind of a result of like archaic technology. So like,
Yeah.
think about how many the 3-ring notebook.
I will ship you a binder.
I have a funny story. I was talking to a leader. I used to do executive coaching and stuff. I was talking to the senior leader, and he goes, "I can see all of our past HR initiatives by the 3-ring binders gathering dust on my shelf."
Yeah. Yeah.
Just so it's for your kids out there. 3-ring binders were the technology learning people had available in the 1990s.
Yep. Yeah, I know. You got shipped it, and it was, I mean, honestly, I remember signing off on invoices for some of those things where you're like, we are spending how much money on this? It was insane.
But going back to the question is, when you look at technology innovation sort of on this learning, what are things that you still are amazed aren't being really leveraged? And when you go
Yeah.
in and say, how come everyone's not using this?
So one in particular that comes to mind immediately for me is you listen to a lot of the industry talk, a lot of the business topics out there. Like everybody's talking about how difficult it is to understand skills and how hard it is to know how to measure skill growth and all that. And I'm sitting there going, what? Like what? No, it is not. Like I don't understand this perception that it's difficult to understand what somebody's able to do and then measure whether they're getting better at it.
Mhm.
But I see it goes back to a couple things where one, your point about there's so many broken processes. A lot of
Mhm.
times we haven't taken the time to actually understand what even a skill means. We just throw these things around. We're like
Yeah.
communication, and you're like, yeah, but what do you mean when you say communicate? Like, what are you talking about when you say, oh, that's bad communication?
Mhm.
How? Like, what are you seeing? What are you observing? And we don't take the time to do that. But then we go, it's impossible to measure communication skills. And it's like, no, it's not. If
Yeah.
you define what they look like, technology is incredible at observing and finding patterns and describing and being able to
Mhm.
go, and I've built simulations around this where it's like, I can do this on the cheap. People
Mhm.
think, oh, I don't have millions of dollars. It's like, you don't need millions of dollars to create something that allows you to go, I need you to do this and let's see
Mhm.
how you perform. And then we're going to say, here's where you need to improve and then do it again. And then I can show quantitatively, Stephen got better at communication.
Yeah, I think, well, as simple as like you could videotape the person, and that's super easy now on the phone. Is there some sort of feedback? Well, we got to dive into that more because I think you have hit on something. I think this is similar to going back to our sort of background as like computer programmers. One of the things you learn very early on in computer programming, and frankly, why I wasn't very good at it, is you have to define exactly what it is you're trying to do.
Yes.
I used my undergrad degree in mathematics. That was probably one of the biggest things I took away from all my math. And I always joke that my job was to make sure the normal curve didn't shift too far to the right. I said there's a lot of students that got A's in math classes because I was there. They would have been B+ students.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. But one of the biggest things that I took away was the absolute importance of defining the problem
Yes.
before you try to get the solution. And I think when you talk about skills or communication or whatever, that's a great example. But going on that, when you look at that though, how I do think there's a real challenge in evaluating skills, though. There are ways to do it, but if you get sort of going back to my question, is there something that you said, okay, look, if you're not using this technology for learning and skills management or
Hmm.
however broadly, you should start using it immediately because it blows my mind that people aren't using that. I'm
Yeah.
curious if there's any things that stand out to you as I can't believe not everyone isn't using this right
So a good example of this, there are a growing number of platforms, but even just integrated into the tools that we have in our companies. We literally are on these virtual meetings all the time
now.
that are capturing our conversations
Mhm.
and transcribing it. So
Mhm.
we have data on how do we communicate.
Mhm.
And AI is extremely good at rapidly analyzing how we're doing and giving us feedback and telling us all
Mhm.
this stuff. And these are the kinds of things where I go, why is not every company doing this? And I get there's IT privacy and security issues and things like that. But when I usually that's not the reasons I bump into when I bump into people and go, why aren't you capturing what people are doing
Mhm.
and then using that data to help coach and develop where they
Mhm.
actually need to grow? It's never, well, IT's doing this or we can't get it through. It's always, well, we're busy making more e-learnings or we're
Mhm.
busy chasing. And I'm like, but why on earth would you be spending your time on that instead of this?
I think that's a really good point. I think particularly we probably have a caveat on who we think should be doing this, and tell me if this is right. So
Sure.
it's not that average employees should be doing it. Ideally, if we're all super enlightened, we'd be self-assessing our skills all the time.
Sure.
But we're
Right.
just trying to use our skills and acquire. But a learning organization, that's fundamentally what it's about: is managing skills, making
Sure.
sure that employees have the
Or
right
even
amount of skills.
CHROs I talk to, where it's like, you care about the talent and skills of your
Mhm.
company. I mean, like that is literally your job, is to
Mhm.
make sure we have the right talent and skills to match the needs of the organization.
Mhm.
That should be your number one priority, is to understand, well, what do we have?
Mhm.
What do we have in here? And it's all at your fingertips. But often it's one of those like, well, we're busy with this other stuff. And I'm like, why though? Like those other things will literally work themselves out once you figure some of these other things.
Well, yeah, it's good. It's almost like, when you're going to do a learning course, you start with learning objectives. But if you don't, the skills are really that's the learning objective of an organization more than
Right.
anything else is
Skills
skills.
are what an HR organization is built on, and actually what many companies are built on. If you don't understand, it's like I don't cook. My wife does. But if I were to go into the kitchen, I
Mhm.
wouldn't say I need to make a thing and not think about what ingredients I need to make that thing.
Mhm.
Because otherwise I'd go, well, geez, dinner didn't make itself. Like, why can I not get dinner on the table? And it's like, what
Mhm.
did you even define what you were trying to make?
Mhm.
And did you check to see if you had the ingredients? Well, no, I wanted to skip that step. It's like we wouldn't do that if we were cooking, but yet we often do that in organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point you're making because if a learning organization, if all they focused on was measuring skills, it would probably help the organization learn a lot.
Yes.
Just, because
Right, because
companies.
we've all been the consumer of it. How many times are you told to go learn something that you go, what value is this adding to me? Like
Mhm.
this has nothing to do with anything I'm focused on, has nothing to do with any of the work. It does not connect to me whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that, and I want to come back and talk more about how you think companies can do this because there is some very sophisticated technology
Yes.
out there that's very cool about measuring skills through scanning email traffic, da 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 da.
Yep.
Um, that, but there's also very traditional things like testing people, in which has a place, which
Yep.
we probably get in the whole conversation of the evaluation, dealing with the fact that people want to know where they stand, but they don't want to be evaluated.
Yeah.
Um, so, but sort of put off this side for a second, though. But sort of diving more into this, there's such this focus on skills right now. It's confused by the fact that as soon as this is the world of HR technology, as soon as any one thing becomes popular, whether it's skills or AI, then suddenly every company does it.
Yep.
I if I see another personality testing company call itself a skills company, I'd be like, dude, personality is important. Don't pretend you're something you aren't. But it's like,
Right. Exactly.
like but we got to get into the RFPs.
Yep.
Um,
It's on the IT checklist. We got to be
it's
able to
not the
say that's
IT
it. And you're like,
technical.
oh gosh.
So going more on the skills, if you're saying, okay, as a company, we need to get more serious about this.
Mhm.
And as a person that's done this for a long time, what do you think is the easiest path to say if like the senior business leader said, I want to know what my people actually know how to do.
Sure.
What's the best way to approach that? Because that's a simple question, but the answer is pretty complicated.
The good news is I think technology is making the answer a lot easier because I look at how we used to do this 10, 15 years ago when I
Mhm.
was in the space. And I'm sure anybody listening can relate. You call
Mhm.
McKinsey, you call Deloitte,
Mhm.
and you pay them millions of dollars to come do something. And by the time they're done with it, it's already outdated because,
Mhm.
well, that's just the way the business moves. But now, a lot of this data, like we were talking about a little bit before, it
Mhm.
exists in your company. You
Mhm.
might not know where, but it's there. It's data housed in different areas, and it's managed in your organization. And there are a handful of companies that have recognized that and said, we can help you repurpose the data to help you understand, not
Mhm.
perfectly, but we can start to get a rapid blueprint of
Mhm.
what you have in your organization. And there's only a handful that are doing it, but the ones that are, they're a great starting point to go, even one, just help us identify what data sources we
Mhm.
have, help do a quick, rapid analysis on what we think we have, and then have somebody with a talent or skill set do some of the contextual stuff. Because that's, I think, one of the things we run into a risk when we get around tech is we assume tech can tell us everything. And it's
Mhm.
like, it can't. It doesn't have context. It doesn't
Mhm.
have emotions. It doesn't understand people. It's an
Mhm.
alien intelligence. So you got to be careful how over dependent you come on it. But these things that we used to think are like a 3-year multi-million-dollar thing, it's like, we actually know you can do that for under 6 figures and be done with it in 60 days.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of people just don't realize that.
That's good. Yeah, I wrote an article recently on skills content solutions, which I think is an interesting you're hitting on. Is and if you agree with this, there's this whole new category that's emerged in the last like 5 years with the natural language processing of these skills ontology solutions.
Yep.
And they do allow you to take data. I think what's important is they don't just there's different ones and they have different use. Some are really good at measuring the labor market. Some are really good at measuring your training courses. Some are really good at measuring your like
Yep.
internal email communication. But there's probably one out there that would help you a lot right away. And they're not necessarily heavy lifts.
No.
On on the flip side, it's hard to build ontologies. So I think part of it's one thing to identify skills that's going to help the learning organization understand. I think it's a whole nother level to build that content to the level that you can give it back to employees.
Yeah. I think it is if you're trying to say, how do we eat the whole elephant? But like the
Hmm.
analogy goes, you do it one bite at a time. And
Hmm.
so I think about a project I was doing with the CHRO where we said, well, let's get started on this. And sometimes, even going back to the kitchen analogy, once you know what's in the kitchen, you
Hmm.
can kind of start to go, well, what recipes do we really want to make? Like, what
Hmm.
ones are the most important to us? And then you can start with that. And I know we were able to do that and look at, based on what the organization's strategic priorities were,
Hmm.
we knew these audiences and these skills were really important. So let's start with that. And like,
Right.
let's make sure that we're aligning some of these things here. Yeah. I mean, are you going to magically have your whole skills ontology built? No, because even that is sometimes just a chasing your tail, because it's like, well, the ontology is going to change by the time you build it into Workday. So maybe don't focus too much on that so much as, well, we can do this. We can identify our core thing. We can pursue that. Once we make measurable, meaningful progress on it, we step back and go, hey, is there something else we could be doing?
Yeah, I totally agree. One of the things that I talk about is narrow skills
Yep.
solutions. That there was this move when they first came out with these ontologies that everyone, and especially the platform, so the core HR companies, we're going to revolutionize the world with skills-based organizations, blah, 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 blah. Sounded really good. And it was this, you're going to create this massive capability for skills by having this ontology that does everything. I think very quickly the world has realized that's extremely hard.
Yes.
It may not even be practical or even realistic, but what we can do is through what you're talking about, like narrow applications. Let's look at skills in this functional area that's important to us. Once we learn about it, then let's think what we want to do. Do we want to change our
Right.
recruiting process, our learning process, but be
Well, and
very
I
problem
think where
focused?
I've seen it work really well is if you do it smart, you build it up in an infrastructure, you build the infrastructure up in a sustainable way, where instead of going, we have to do this for the whole company,
Hmm.
you build it intelligently so that you can actually hand off to your business partners and different business functions and goes, here's how it works.
Hmm.
Here's what you need to do. We can help consult you through it. But I don't know what your priorities are, but I can show you how to focus on your priorities and understand this and then help them go through it. But going back to your point where you can spend a lot of time on stuff that's like a waste, when skills ontologies kind of were the big rage, everybody wanted to have an enterprise skills ontology.
Hmm.
And then the goal was like, let's map, we'll use the learning analogy because it sticks. Let's map all our learning content to the skills ontologies, and it'll be a really good use of our time.
Hmm.
Well, it assumes people know and think in terms of skills, which if we don't do a good job in HR at that, Lord forbid, thinking that the average user thinks to themselves, in terms of the skills I'm applying in this activity I'm doing today, I need to develop this critical
Yeah.
thinking skill in the it's like people don't think that way. So you can go through the effort of trying to structure and library all this stuff. It's like that's not how people they think in terms of I'm trying to do this thing.
Right.
And you can waste a lot of time on stuff that's like, yeah, sounds good in a presentation or a keynote at HR Tech, but
Right.
in practical speak, that's just not the way the world turns.
Well, this is interesting because if I'm use the analogy to or comparison to what is the most widely known ontology solution, which is ChatGPT, right?
Yep.
Going on natural language. What has happened, people say, is you went from this big thing to like building their own small models with whatever generative AI, feeding in their own data. And as you said, it's equipped people to use this tool for lots of different things. And if I hear you correctly, which is an interesting evolution of this field in learning, you're seeing the same thing in organizations where it's like, we are going to give you, probably like HR business partner for different departments of the organization, this tool that allows you to point it and understand what are the skills in the part of the workforce you work with that you need, and then you
Yep.
can do with it what you want.
Yes.
That's an interesting. That's a very different approach than I think the way the market has been thinking about it before.
Well, and I think it largely goes back to this big systemic issue that we have where oftentimes we're trying to do empire building instead of business enablement. And it's this more idea of like, how do we do all the things for everyone? And it's like, well, you fail at that. That's how you do it. You fall on your face instead of going, how do we set up a sustainable ecosystem and infrastructure that we then just become an enablement partner? And that's our focus is how do we set up these little catalysts for growth across the board? And I think sometimes there's this idea, well, but if we do that, then they won't need us anymore. And it's like,
No.
I don't know what business you've ever worked in where they go, nah, we're good. We got this all figured out. They need that help. If anything, your role just changes so that instead of that business leader calling you going, I need said report or I need X assignment of these e-learnings, you're working with them on, well, wait, what are you trying to do? And is
Right.
this even the right report to be running? And what does this really mean? And what if we were to go deeper on that? And honestly, I don't know very many HR people I run into that go, I actually wish I was. I don't know many that would go, I don't want to spend my time on that. I
Mhm.
love running pivot tables. That's what I loved. Like, but yet we trap ourselves in it.
So I could, yeah, we could go down the same concepts apply definitely to like analytics for sure, or probably every aspect of
Yep.
HR, which is how do we empower. So who do you see as the main person you're empowering with these solutions? Because I can see a lot of issues if you said, okay, we want to empower line managers to assess the skills of their own workforce. And I could see that being
Yeah.
one, they'd be a path fraught with peril. Let me just put it that way.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
who is it, do you think, if you're a learning organization, who are you trying to empower with these tools?
So I think there's a maturity curve that comes into play on this. And as I've run these over the years, it changes with time. You know, typically I'm always building this up. Whenever I've built this up in HR organizations, it starts with we are doing a lot of it for you.
Mhm.
You know, we're almost like a little internal consultancy that will come in and
Mhm.
we'll do this for you. Over time, that then gets started, it starts to be transmitted over to like the HRBPs, like you said, because it's like,
Mhm.
well, you're more there in the day to day. We can coach and teach you how
Mhm.
to do more of this. We also know you have that kind of human centered lens. So you're going to keep the checks and balances and make sure this stuff isn't used to exploit or end us
Right.
up in legal hot water
Mhm.
type of a thing. But then over time, it starts to mature. And then, you know, there are people in the line business who might go, hey, here's somebody who is trusted and we've got super users that have
Mhm.
this capability. But the reality is the nature of the business is those super users get laid off or they quit
Mhm.
and then you move back or that HRBP leaves and you're like, well, we're back to, and so you're kind of in this constant cycle of, well, we're here, we're in stage 3 with this function, we're in stage 1 with this group, and you're in this constant shift of going through those cycles.
I think that's a really interesting. I agree with you completely. I think also it's embracing that, because I think what
Yeah.
happens historically is the other company said, well, we do either our COE does it or we push it out to the business to do it. When the reality is your ability to push it out to the business doesn't depend on who's in the business to do it. And you
Right.
kind of need to go back and forth, because when you force I've seen this, oh, the business has to support it, and then there's no one there, they're not going to use you.
No.
And then
And
you
then they
just
go, thanks
lose.
a lot. And then that's when you get laid off because they go, thanks for all these solutions that you throw in our lap that add no value to us. Or on the flip side, it's like, no, we're the COE, we're going to do everything. And then they go, well, you don't move it at our pace and you don't understand our issues. And both are,
That is such a fascinating thing when you think about it in general around the whole role of support functions and how they're managed in organizations. Is support functions, they put these hard and fast rules and these financial rules, and they don't think about how a support function has to run depends on the nature of who they're supporting. And when the
yeah,
workforce changes, that I've never seen an organization whose financial workforce planning models think about the fact we need this permeable
yeah,
headcount budget, if you
yeah,
will.
yeah.
When you lose people here, this group's going to have to do more work, but then eventually they don't want to stay in that work and they want to pull it back. That's really fascinating, because that's how the world works, but that is not how companies
And
plan and
I think
structure
this
their
is one of the
COEs.
biggest challenges we run into as organizations. We're like, why can't we crack this? And it's like, we can't crack it because we've put ourselves in this box. And
Yeah.
then we go, I can't reach outside the box. And it's like, well, why do you have the box there in the first place? Remove the
Yeah.
walls and you can accomplish some of this stuff.
Wow, that's fascinating too, because it gets into the dynamic nature of what you need from a support function. It depends on who they support, and as you have your turnover and restructuring. But as you know, most companies do this all annually, the planning.
Right.
But these things
And
don't
so
play out annually at all; they play out
no.
continuously.
And so what I've found is for me, when I've done this internally, I find what is my steady state. Because again, things are always moving. There's like seasons where it's heavy COE focused, and then there's seasons where it's heavy business focused.
Mhm.
And then things turn and certain groups are in different levels of maturity. And so but you kind of start to find your baseline where you're like, yeah, there's the ebbs and flows, but usually the baseline's here. And I'll workforce plan my teams around that
Mhm.
and then use like consulting dollars or project dollars to help fill in those gaps. So it's completely possible to do, but you have to have that mindset going into it or you'll just get thumped.
Yeah, that just kind of waves going in and out, right?
Yep.
So we're talking. I want to go back to the technology a little bit. That was a
Sure.
fascinating insight, though, because who uses the technology, what technology you use depends on who's going to use it, and really thinking about that
Exactly.
and that role of that. So going back on learning, though, you talked to us one, the skills ontology is getting much better tools for discovering skills. I do think part of it is also spend time just talking to people. Don't forget
Yes.
that.
Massively gets misunderstood and missed all the time.
Yeah, so build that into your plan. But the what about the next part, which is, kind of look at learning. There's figuring out what people need to learn. There's delivering the learning. Um, then there is evaluating whether or not they're actually doing it, whether they know how to do
Mhm.
it or they're applying it, right? The three sort of phases of
Yep.
learning, if you will. I'm curious in your thoughts on the second one. We'll go through all three, but in the second one,
Yeah.
what are you seeing again? Same sort of question when you're looking at technology, either existing technology that's underutilized or new technology. And I'm almost more interested in the existing stuff, because I think that's where it's like, look, this isn't new. You can go out and get it. It's probably relatively cheaply affordable, as opposed to some of the new stuff is cool, but it's not really pragmatic in some
Yeah.
sense, right?
So when it comes to a lot of the measurement stuff, I mean, I talked about some of these tools. A lot of these tools for stuff have their own analytics built into it. But I think one of the things I, over the years, have spent a lot of time doing that is always part of the work I do is we often grossly miss how much of this technology is actually already in our ecosystem. A lot of the data, a lot of these
Mm-hmm.
business platforms that are holding analytics or the IT's managing this or
Mm-hmm.
finance has this. And really, when you think about the fact that what we're doing should be impacting those outcomes,
Mm-hmm.
we
Right.
keep looking for systems to go, how do we capture that data? And it's like, but if our goal is to achieve what matters to these stakeholders,
Mhm.
Shouldn't we be looking at the data sources they're looking at? Because
Mhm.
isn't that ultimately what matters? And so when I think about kind of that middle ground, well, I'll use a sim example. Okay.
Mhm.
So when I was doing this with GE, we did this big thing where we identified the sales teams
Mhm.
were struggling catastrophically with their interactions with physicians. We
Mhm.
knew it. We knew this was the breakdown of things. We knew what a good interaction looked like. We knew what we were seeing.
Mhm.
And so we were able to simulate that using AI to be able to do it and then have people go through it. And that what that did was it gave us the skills data to go, do they know how to do it? That answered one part of the story, and I think that's what we miss with
Mhm.
data is it's a story. You're telling a story. There's different characters and components to a story.
Mhm.
There's not like what's the one story.
Mhm.
No, it's a dynamic thing. And so we were able to capture some of that skill stuff to go, here's what we know they need to do. Here's how they're doing. Here's how that's improving. But then we tapped into the business analytics that the sales team already had to go, is this improving the outcomes you care about? And
Mhm.
they were able to see that and tell us it wasn't. And one of the things that was interesting about it is when we did it, we realized one of the skills we were focusing on actually had no relevance. It was
Hmm.
completely irrelevant to the business outcome. Here we were like, no, we got to get them doing this and it's going to drive business results. And once we proved quantitatively we had improved that skill
Mhm.
and it had zero impact, we went, okay. I mean, it was like being a scientist. You're like,
Right. No,
well,
that's
clearly that skill has nothing to do with this.
what
And
what
so
what was the skill that didn't matter? Can you share it?
it
Just
had to
curious.
do with being able to articulate our product capability. We thought and I suspected it wouldn't have the value that the business did, but there was a belief that if we can just articulate what our product does,
Mhm.
they will buy it.
Right. Yeah.
And so one of the big metrics was how do you describe our product? And do you say the right things? And do you use the
Yeah.
marketing speak that we do? And so that was a heavy metric. And we showed we moved it big time. And it had
Wow.
no impact whatsoever. It was like, nope, they don't care. And it's not that they don't care about our product, but that's not what makes them
Yeah, it's
change their
when you
behavior.
buy a car from somebody, you don't expect the person to be able to explain the details of the engine, right?
No.
Um, or most people don't. I think the that's really interesting too. Is you think about the financial impact of it. A couple of things that I would sort of pull away from that story. One is, and it's interesting because you're talking about delivering and developing training, but you went right back to start with measurement. Like we have to,
Yep.
first of all, what is it people are not able to do or are struggling to do that we think could be fixed with skills, right?
Yes.
That don't start with the skills, start with the performance issues,
Right.
which,
Which actually the funny part of the story is the whole thing kicked off with the chief product officer coming to me going, "We need product training." And I remember
mhm,
going, "Why?" Because our people aren't speaking well enough about our product. And I remember going, "How do you know that? And why does that matter?" And as we dug into it, that's actually how we diagnosed, oh, there's this physician conversation
mhm,
that is failing catastrophically. And what we really need to do is improve that physician conversation because that's what's killing us. And once we diagnosed that, then it was like, maybe we need product training, but I don't actually think we do. And once we proved with skills that product training actually had zero, I was able to prove that we saved the company tens of millions of dollars
yeah, it's
in
enormous.
wasted effort.
But it's also, I think it takes a certain courage of pushing back to say, look, one thing is for certain, every company needs to train its employees more.
Sure.
It's like they've never mastered it. When people have totally mastered all aspects of performance and whatever, okay, but that's never going to happen. You can always,
Right.
and it is a,
And even once they master it, it's going to change and their
yeah,
mastery is going to go back to like junior development.
yeah. And if you can make, there's all sorts of benefits that come out of it. The challenge is figuring out what exactly is the training that we should do. And there's
Yep.
tremendous cost if you focus on the wrong thing.
Yes.
And I think with learning companies, certainly learning professionals, but having that courage to push back and say, look, I don't want to waste your time. I don't want to waste my time. And so, but there's always that pressure of the business of do something, do something, do something. It's not, I don't think it's necessarily learning professionals that are the, 'um, shoot first, aim later kind of mindset. And of course, you also on the technology side, the people selling this technology, they don't want you to just want you to, buy this technology and implement
Right.
it. Um, how if you're kind of in that world where you're like, all right, I'm a learning leader, I've got the business like saying I need training to fix some problem, and they think they know what the training is, and I've got
Yeah.
these solutions over here. How do you manage that business constructively? Because I mean, it is stopping to define the problem. Some people will just hear stopping and they won't hear anything else.
Yeah. So there is an art and a science to it. And I think this is where my like human psychology
Hmm.
comes into play, where it's like you are constantly it's why I got into the field I did, because computers were boring. They're predictable. You know
Hmm.
what they're going to do. People are fascinating, and you have to
Hmm.
be relentlessly curious about, okay, every conversation I have goes slightly different. Like I've had people be like, Christopher, what are the 5 things I do? And I'm like, well, the 5 things you do, the first one is throw out the 5 things you think
Hmm.
you need to do. Because going into those, are there times where I've had a leader where it's like, if I just push on the we need to go deeper, I'm going to get thrown out of the room.
Hmm.
So I might have to meet them with a let's take some steps towards that. And in the same time, let's see if we can go deeper at the same time. And sometimes I've had to push that analysis into the process of stepping forward and maybe letting something hit a failure point first and going, ooh, before we go further, we're seeing early indications of failure. Do you really want to push into failure? And there have been times I have let things go all the way to catastrophic failure, because it's like, well, if that's really what you want to do, but I'm going to make it clear to you that I think this is that. There's other times where I remember one conversation where the CMO and I were across the table from each other, shouting at each other. And I finally stopped and said, I am trying to help you.
Right.
Will you let me help you? And it cut the tension, because once it was like, okay, so that's where, when I look at the dynamic series of relationships I've had, I can't really think of a this is how to do it, other than to put their needs first and be relentlessly curious about it.
Wow. As you're telling us, it's striking an emotional chord. My wife's a family medicine doctor, and you can imagine she gets people coming in are like, give me a pill for something
Yep.
immediately. And she actually has had that multiple times, that very conversation. Just had to stop people that have been yelling at her saying, I am trying to help you. You
Yes.
know, but helping you is not doing what you think you need,
Yes.
because that's my expertise, and getting in and finding a way to do that. I want to go. This is such a great discussion around how to, before you even think about the technology, really defining the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah.
Going back to technology, though, because you've been in this space, there has been an explosion of learning tech. There's micro learning technology, social learning technology, virtual learning technologies that are really cool. I think they all have a lot of value. Um, how are you seeing this just explosion of technology requiring the learning function to change or to not change?
So there's a couple things. Two that come to mind is, like every function, we tend to struggle with what we're comfortable with and being impressed with our own wares. Like
Hmm.
we're like, I love what we do. And isn't what we do so cool? And it's like, well, it really does not matter, because if the end user thinks it sucks, like I don't really care how cool what we do is. And so as I look at some of the technologies, HR, learning, talent acquisition, a lot of these things, a lot of times one of the biggest barriers is we're obsessed with how we're comfortable doing it and what matters to us. And so I look at some of these things where it's like, are you pursuing micro learning as an example because you think, ooh, that's the thing to do and we love it and it'll help us with this? Or is it that you've actually talked to your audience and they're strapped for time, and the way the business is moving, they need to do things differently, and you're looking at, what everybody's on social media doing these
Hmm.
TikTok, Instagram trends. So if that's what consumer behavior is familiar with, we need to adapt to that. And I think that miss is where things often mess up with technology, is it's more of an obsession of what we want to do instead of what do we need to do.
Yeah, and then to add to the hype of trying to get you to obsess on it, that this comes to these companies. I think as you're talking, one of the things too with especially learning technology, if you look at it, if learning technology is doing what it's supposed to do, it's making people more successful in their jobs, which
Yes.
they want to be. People want to be.
Yes.
I mean, the exception might
You
be
don't
the
have to
stuff that's
sell them on that. That's the thing. A lot of times there's all these like marketing campaigns to get people to learn. It's like if learning is getting better at your job, you
right.
don't have to sell people on that. They'll be like, well, yeah, I want to get better at my job.
And they'll adopt. I mean, how many of us the first time
Yes.
we discovered YouTube could show us how to solve, fix our
Kitchen
dishwasher or
sink.
whatever, and then boom, we use it all the time, right?
Yep.
So, so I guess you might make an exception for like mandatory regulatory training, but
Sure.
but for for the stuff we get excited about is in learning professionals. So if you think about that, okay, first of all, if the technology does what it's supposed to do, it's going to make people more successful.
Yep.
Somebody told me years ago, they said if the technology provides relevant value to the end user and it's easy to use, the technology is the change management.
Yes.
It's like,
So a good example of this. Okay. I worked in a huge pharmaceutical company in the regulatory business with regulatory scientists. And, there were so many things that I was like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we could do this? Or we should do this. And this will be this radically different way of shaping things. And as I would talk to some of the folks, they would go, where's the PDF? And I'm like, where's the PDF? Like, we can do animated video and we can do simulate and we can do all this. Why do you keep asking for the PDF? And then I started to understand their workflows and the way they did things. And I started going, oh, okay. I understand why this matters to you. And now I'm understanding your pain points. And I remember at the time, I ended up implementing Inkling because it was like, no, documentation is critical to these people. It's the way they do their work. Now, can I start to incorporate some of these innovative different ways? Because you can stereotype regulatory scientists to be super boring, not interested in anything, and they would rather just read binary code than engage with their children. And it's like, actually, no, that's not true. They're very
happy to hear
dynamic
that.
people. They're dynamic people. But I understood their pain point and how they worked. And once I did that, I was able to go, okay, we're going to present things to you as documentation, but it's going to be a kind of documentation you're not familiar with, but you are familiar with. It's the same, and yet it's radically different. And I didn't have to sell anybody on, you know what, go do your SOP in Inkling anymore. They just did it. And they were like, holy crap, this thing came to life in ways that I've never done it before. And it was like, well, right, because I understood what you do and what you need and how to get you there.
Yeah, and it's linking, is it that idea? I mean, it's linking it to their work. They see how it's going to help them solve, and you might just do a little push to get them to try it once, but then once they see it, like, oh man, this make my life easier.
Yeah.
There was a really interesting research actually that Microsoft did on the use of generative AI. Sort of like for emails and stuff like that, and they said if it saves somebody, I think it was more than like 25 minutes a day, then they moved over towards it.
Yep.
There's sort of this, and so because learning a new way to learn is itself a learning curve you've got to go up, which I have a question on that too, especially when like the knowledge management aspect of it. So like, I think there in my lifetime, there's been Word doc, SharePoint, OneNote, email. I mean, there's all these different places that you share, and my brain is distributed across each different thing. People get comfortable with whatever sort of knowledge management tool that they use, and sometimes they know it's not the best, but it's like asking you to like move houses, right? Yeah, I could live in a better house, but it'd be a real pain in the neck to move, right?
Right.
How do you manage that? So is that a problem that's ever come up? Because I'm looking at technologies, and you can end up, you could have part of the workforce living on one technology and part of the workforce living on another technology.
Yeah. So I remember, and this will tie to like enterprise search. So, with knowledge management, a lot of times the historical way has been like, how do we get everyone onto one system?
Yeah.
And the number of companies I've been with who like that was their thing. We're going to get all the knowledge in our company into one repository. And anytime I've been in that situation, I'm always like, do you want to fail? Because if you do, then let's continue with this pathway.
Mhm.
Let's shut down every system and let's pull it together. Because again, that's not the way work works. It just doesn't work that way. And so I think about some of those where you go, well, but how does work work? Well, we have these different systems, we have these different things. So how do we then connect them together? And then what do people do when they need something? Well, they ask a question. Well, how do they ask a question? Where do they ask a question? How do we put more of those points, entry points in for them to ask a question that doesn't require them to know, well, do I go to SharePoint for this one? Do I go over to Panopto for this? But can start to do it. And I think that's where generative AI has some massive opportunity. We got some kinks to work out with it. But I mean, when you think about human behavior, when we get stuck, most of the time we want to
Mhm.
just ask a question, whether I'd like
Yeah.
to ask you, Stephen,
Mhm.
or I'm more comfortable typing it into a web browser. I
Mhm.
don't know. There's different people who have different things, but ultimately that's what people want to do. So then how do we make asking a question easier?
I think that is, I think of the agentic AI stuff too, where it's able to access different data sources and stuff like
Yep.
that's going to be a big step forward. I'm curious how you've dealt with something that I've always wondered about when somebody, a user interface design guy once told me something I thought was brilliant. He said, it is it's arrogant and cruel to ever design a technology that prevents a human from talking to another human. And his example was if you looked at a lot of learning management systems, you got to ask the question. Like the problem is, I don't even know what question to ask. I need to talk to a person. Well, you got to file a ticket, and they'll get back to you. And you're just like, I'm just trying to get my work done, and this thing's preventing me. And literally, I think we've all had this experience. Your blood pressure is literally raising up.
Yep.
How do you see keeping the humans in the loop on the learning side to help employees to say? It kind of goes back to our conversation about the COE staffing.
Sure.
I mean, what is your view of
Yeah.
the
So
role of humans in learning?
so the thing with it is, I think about this in like the self checkout. Okay, you think about this, and I did some work with a retail company, a grocery company, that we were trying to figure out how best to do grocery checkout. And
Mhm.
at first, it was like we just need to have all self checkout lanes, and they
Mhm.
realized they were losing customers because that didn't address the full scope of what people actually need. Like sometimes people
Mhm.
needed help.
Yeah.
And then you also sometimes had people who just going to the grocery store was their social experience
Mhm.
and they wanted a slow lane. They didn't care that they waited for 2 hours in a line because
Mhm.
they chatted up every single person in the lane and then they chatted up their person
Mhm.
and they had the opportunity of choice. And I think about keeping humans in the loop. It's giving us opportunity to put people in different roles based on what is actually needed. So like I think about learning. We ran a pilot with a text engine that was wildly successful. Where it was like you can ask us anything, and it was text whatever to this number and ask us anything.
Mhm.
And we had trained an agent to be able to answer like basic stuff because
Mhm.
sometimes I don't actually want to deal with a person if you can just
Right.
tell me. It's like when I call Comcast and I get on the phone
Mhm.
with somebody, they're like, "Did you reset your route?" And you're like, "Quit asking me that. I
Right.
did that 5 times already."
Right.
And so, but we had trained rules in it for where does it hand off
Mhm.
and what is the person that it's interacting with and
Mhm.
do they want, and if they keep saying agent, 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 then listen, because what we need to do is enable them. And I think that's where you often have these things going back to some of the themes we've been talking about. We're trying to design things with these hard, fast rules of, okay, everything goes to this until it reaches this escalation point and all of that. And generative AI is opening the possibility to go, yeah, you you might not need that. There may be somebody who actually can get to level 3 with Gen AI because they're self-independent and they don't actually want to
Mhm.
talk to a person. But then you might have this other handoff that you get the tier 1 person. They actually do want the person to talk them through how to unplug their router. And I
Mhm.
think that's where Gen AI is actually opening up opportunity to say, well, actually, now we can put humans in the loop at all levels, but we optimize when and how they're used.
Well, yeah, I think that, and that idea of sort of allowing a scaling of people getting in and out, that's really important as we're thinking
Yeah.
about this, which is different from historically where people would view learning technology as a way to like get rid of humans.
Yeah.
To
Right.
build it back in. So We just have a couple minutes. Really quick question. If there was
Sure.
one technology out there you wish somebody would build, what is it?
Uh, I so so here's a technology that I think would be amazing. I think, and it would be some sort of AI solution. Everybody's focused on what you should do or how you should do things.
Mhm.
I think we need more things that tell us what to stop doing. That,
Mhm.
you get these things. Do you want to do this? Do you want to do that? You're trying to do this. Can I help you with that? With all these things that are watching what we're doing, I would
Mhm.
actually love something that said, you're spending a lot of time on this. It's not adding any value.
Mhm.
Do you maybe want to consider getting rid of that? And here's why. Because I see people completely overloaded and swamped, and there's enormous pressure to do more, do it faster. And
Mhm.
that capacity has to come from somewhere. And I
Mhm.
don't think there's really anything out there that helps us go, yeah, but where's that going to come from? And we have the data to do it, and we can help people do it.
Well, I think coming from a place of love, my wife certainly helps me with that.
So does mine.
Yeah. But, the and the very last question, is is there a question, as we had this conversation, which has been fascinating, is there a question that you think, Steve, you never asked this question, but this is an important question we should be asking, and the caveat is you've got to answer it.
Yeah. I think one of the things we aren't asking enough that we need to be asking more of, especially, if you watched this week, Google came out with its
Mm.
quantum computer. There's some major developments happening, and going back to this idea that there's just this relentless march to just keep marching forward, and we're not asking the question, just because we can, should we?
Mhm.
And there's a lot of things that I see in the HR space. I talk to a lot of SaaS providers that are creating new capabilities, and nobody's asking the question, yeah, but should we even be doing this? Is this something that actually is in our best interest? Because there's a lot of things that I don't think are, and we're not looking around corners. And I look at social media as one of these things where we thought, hey, this is great. Like everybody's going to love it. It's going to connect us and people are going to feel good about themselves. And depression rates are higher. People are more addicted to tech than they've ever been. And it was like, maybe had we asked some of the questions of, should we even do this? We could prevent some of the long-term consequences we often don't see hit us until it's too late.
Wow. Yeah, I think I don't really know. I agree with you. I think as you're talking about that, there's a great book called The Invention of Nature. It's about Alexander von Humboldt, a naturalist in the 19th century. And the point they said is that industrialization got so far ahead that they almost didn't even get to ask the question, should we be conserving natural resources? And like, in the US, they eliminated the Amazon rainforest and the Serengeti in one lifetime. If
Yep.
you look at the Mississippi forest. And it feels like, to your point, when you were talking, that's what it made me think of, that we got this technology marching forward so quickly that we're not even realizing what we're consuming and the implications of that.
Right.
I
And look at the industrial one that you used
Yeah.
there. That took a lifetime.
Yeah.
This could happen in 12 months.
Yeah.
Things could happen and we could 20 years from now go, "Oh my gosh." And so the acceleration of this and the opportunity to catch this stuff before it goes too far, that window is closing. And that's probably one of my biggest concerns is the decisions we're making today, they're not decisions our kids or our grandkids are going to feel the pain of. They're things that like we might feel the pain of in 2 years
Oh,
if we're not careful.
yeah, boy, you raise a very heady question. I wish I had some how to answer that.
Yeah, there's a great note to end on.
No, no, I think it's good. As you look at this, it's kind of like a lot of stuff you talked about, the keeping the humans in the learning loop. But this has been Christopher, has been a fantastic conversation. I love these discussions where we start out about learning technology. We got into the structure of COEs. We got into engaging the business. So thank you very much for appearing on Integrator Die.
Thank you for having me.